Hi, everyone, welcome and thanks for joining the webinar today. And the topic I will discuss is about modeling neighborhood mortality using the random forest model. My name is Jay Wen, and I'm a final year PhD student from the Neighbourhood University. And although I'm the only presenter today here, but all of the works included in this pack, they are joined with both my PhD supervisors, Andrew Cairns and Torsten Kleinow, from the School of Mathematical and Computer Sciences in the Neighbourhood University. And all of the works here, they're also under a bigger research subject, which is funded by the Actuarial Research Center of the Institute and the Faculty of Actuaries, the Society of Actuaries of North America, and the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. Okay, so let's start with a brief summary of all of the contents I'm discussing today. First of all, I will introduce the data we use to construct the model and the modeling framework we follow to construct the model. And then the second section is about the main topic today. It's about random forest model. What is it and how does it work? And what's the main differences between random forest model and many other more commonly used models nowadays? And the third section is about the results. I will report and discuss some of the results we can obtain from the random forest model. And lastly is the high-level summary section over all of the contents I have discussed in today's webinar. Okay, now let's start from the data and the modeling framework. Okay, the data we use is the neighborhood level mortality data in England. Which the background story is England contains around 33,000 small geographical areas, which are called lower layers, so-called output areas, in short, RSOs. And each of the RSOs has a population size of around 1,500. And those population in one RSOA, they in general should have socioeconomic homogeneity, because this is one of the split criteria that the RSOAs are created within England. And for every RSOA, there are gender-specific death and exposure data available in single RSOA, year, T, and HX, which is DITX and EITX. You know, the format of these D and E, they are pretty much similar to the data used by most of the other mortality models as well. And in terms of the age range, we focus on population of pensionable ages, which means those above age 60, those already retired, or those close to retirement. And in order to construct this model, we need both predictive and response variable as the observation data set. So for the predictive variables, we have the socioeconomic factors available at individual RSOAs. And for example, XIG means the J's variable in the RSOA I. And they are both numerical and categorical variables. And most of them are gender neutral, and they are homogeneous over all of the ages. So in terms of the response variable, because the purpose of the model is to estimate mortality, and then we have taken a metric called relative mortality risk in every RSOA as the response variable. So it is defined by single age, which is derived using a rolling 10-year age interval for the particular age at the midpoint. So for example, for age 65, we have used the data over the age range of 60 to 69. And for the age 85, we have used the age interval over age 80 to 89, which is actually -5 and +5 of the underlying age we target at. Okay, now let's look at all of the predictive variables we use in constructing the model. And so there are 12 of them in total. And we can see that from X1 to X9, all of the first 9 variables, they are about different aspects of socioeconomics. So for example, X1 is the income deprivation score of the old age population within one RSOA. X2 is the employment deprivation score. X3 is the education in deprivation score. And we also have housing standard, which is actually the average number of bedrooms per household within one particular RSOA. So this measures like how comfortable and how large is per household, whether it's too crowded or whether it's about the right size. And we also have something like employment occupation measures. So it's a proportion of population that takes a management position. And we also have crime rate, and we also have the proportion of population working more than 49 hours per week. So for example, this is a measure of the work intensity and how much pressure do the population within one RSOA face. And so after the first 9, we also have X10 and X11. The measures the proportion of population that is aged above 60 resident in a care home, either with nursing or without nursing service. Although the presence of care home is not directly relevant to the socioeconomics, but in our research, we indeed found that both of the care home metrics, they have a quite huge impact on the level of mortality risk within one RSOA. And so all of the variables from X1 to X11, they are the numerical variables. And last but not least, we also have X12 as a categorical variable, which indicates the level of urban-rural classification that one RSOA is. I will discuss this in the next slide. Yeah, so in summary, we have around 33,000 RSOAs, and we have 12 predictive variables. And then the whole variable space is actually a 33,000 times 12 matrix, which is written as X here. And in terms of the 5 levels of urbanization, which is as X12, there are 5 levels can be defined for each of the RSOA. Class 1 means RSOAs as urban conurbation areas, but except those in London. Next 2 are those RSOAs as urban city and towns, which are a bit smaller than class 1, but they're still big cities and towns. And X3 and so class 3 and class 4, they are those RSOAs a bit classified as rural areas, for example, towns, villages, and those sparsely distributed residential areas. And at last, class 5, those are also the urban conurbation areas, but they are those RSOs within London. So in summary, class 1 and class 5, those are the most urbanized RSOs. And from class 2, class 3 to class 4, we can see a decreasing level of urbanization of the RSOs in these 3 classes. So after the predictive variables, let's look at the response variable. So as I have discussed earlier, the response variable is a relative mortality risk, so which is defined as an actual versus expected death ratio. So in short, AE ratio in every single RSOA. First of all, so the calculation is pretty straightforward. So first of all, we calculate the national average death rate by single ages and years, so X and T spot. So that's an aggregation over all of the RSOAs I within England. And then based on the MBTX here, and we do the following calculations. So we calculate the total number of deaths within one single RSOAs that covers a group of ages and years, so which is the sum over T and X for every single I. And then we calculate the D hat 0I, which is interpreted as the expected number of deaths covering a particular group of ages and years within single RSOAs. And then we can see from the formula that the expected here means it is calculated for single RSOAs, but it is calibrated to the national average mortality. And then we can calculate the RI0, which is the ratio between DI over the D height 0I. So this is the actual versus expected ratio over the over a selected group of ages and years by single RSOAs. And from the definition here, we can see that the R0 actually measures the empirical relative mortality risk in one RSOI that is relative to the national average mortality. And for if one RSOE has R0 close to 1, that means this RSOE has a mortality risk close to the national average level, and vice versa, if another RSOE having R0 much bigger than or much lower than 1. Okay, so now with both predictive variables and response variable readily available, and we train the random forest model here using all of the 33,000 RSOs, but we split them into two halves as disjoint subsets. And one of the subset is called training set, so and which we use to train the random forest model using these RSOs. And the other subset is called validation set. And these validation set contains RSOs we use for model validation, so which means they're not directly involved in model training, and we only use them as out of sample observations to select the most appropriate hyperparameters within the random forest model. And these two sets, they are disjoint, and they together just forms the full sample of 33,000 RSOs. And there's a terminology here, hyperparameters. This is quite common concept within all of the non-parametric models. So these are the parameters in non-parametric models. They control the bias and variance trade-off. So for example, the balance between underfitting and overfitting the model. So we have to choose the most appropriate hyperparameters to make sure that the model is not either underfit or overfit. And today I won't discuss too many details about hyperparameters, but if any of you are interested in hyperparameters, there are a lot of textbooks online you can get access to, which have good, very nice introductions and discussions about these definition, or you can email me directly if you want. I will be more than happy to answer any questions on this. And so now let's look at the random forest model and also regression trees, because everyone knows forest is made up of trees. So we have to look at these two definitions together. Sorry, it's a bit slow to change slide here. Okay, so in summary, random forest model is an ensemble of multiple regression trees, which is a package of different trees altogether. And we use as we discussed earlier, we use the observed A versus E ratio as the response variable, and alongside the observed socioeconomic factors in X as the predictive variables to train the regression trees. And we denote one particular regression tree as F hat B here. So there are capital B trees in total within the random forest. And although I can write it down as F hat B, but it is a non-parametric model, so it doesn't have any closed form formula we can write down on paper. And every single F hat B in a random forest model is trained only using a randomly selected subset of RSOs, rather than all of the RSOs in the training set. I will go back to this point later on. And the F hat B xi here, if we substitute xi into the tree model, so this is the estimate of the relative risk in one RSOI using the non-socioeconomic factors in the xi using the tree model F hat B here. So the way in which every single tree is trained is as follows. So briefly speaking, every tree is derived following binary split in reference to the socioeconomic variables, so all of these splits, they stratify the training data sets into disjoint groups of RSOs. And these groups of RSOs, they are called nodes of the tree. And all of the splits, they are made iteratively in different steps to those existing nodes created by the earlier splits, so which is like a hierarchical structure chart. And so before making every split, there are three factors to consider, which is quite important. And first one is which existing node to split. Second one is, if we want to make a split, which predictor variable we use to split, and also what value to use as a split boundary along this particular predictive variable selected. And so in general, the principle of selecting all of these three factors is to optimize the improvement in accuracy of the model by making every split. And all of the RSOs within the same node, they have exactly the same estimate by the tree function, which is the average over all of the observed relative risk of all RSOs within that node. And that's why f hat b, the tree function, is a piecewise constant function. It can only takes one of the number of node we have in the tree in total. The previous slide might be a bit too abstract to understand for many of the users of the model, and so that's why now I have introduced a stylized example and to show the how this regression tree works in a more visualized way. So we pick up a single regression tree model, which is trained using the observed R0 and only 2 predictive variables instead of 12. So we picked up x1 equal to inc old, which is the old age income deprivation score, and x2 as imp, which means the employment deprivation score. These are the only 2 variables we use here. And we can plot all of the RSOs within a 2D plan here. And you see the x-axis is the inc old and the y-axis is the employment score. And so all of the grid dots, so every dot represents one of the RSOs, and for each of the dots, we know the observed R0, and we also know the value of the 2 predictive variables we use here. And so as I mentioned earlier, for every regression tree within random forest model, we only use a randomly selected subset of the RSOs rather than all of the RSOs in the training set. So those dots colored by the dark red, those are the RSOs randomly selected for training this particular regression tree. Okay, now let's look at the first split the algorithm makes into the variable space. So the algorithm, the tree algorithm thinks the first split s equal to 1 here is the best one to make. So which is made by the inc old. And so that means that all of the RSOs, they are classified into 2 different groups or nodes. And the criteria is to see whether every RSOE has inc old score smaller than 0.35 or bigger than 0.35. Those having inc old smaller than this boundary is classified into this region, and those others are classified into that region. And so at this stage, we actually have an estimate of relative risk for every RSOE. So which is quite simple. Everything here on this half, they have the estimate of relative risk as the average over R0 over all of them, and vice versa for all of the RSOs on this side, they have the estimate of the relative risk as the average over all of the R0 on this side. Okay, so after the first split, it's definitely not accurate enough because this model is still quite underfit, and then we look at the next split to make. Then after s equal to 1, the algorithm now thinks, okay, I'm going to keep making split using encode because encode is more important predictive variable. Then it makes s equal to 2, another boundary here. So this is the second split made by the algorithm. And so this s equal to 2, the second split is made to this half of the RSOs. So which means this node of RSOs is not changed after making the second split. And for RSOs on this half, now they have 2 different estimates. So for everything in this region, and the estimate is the average over everything here. But for any RSOE within this narrow region in the middle, and their estimate is going to be the average over all of these RSOEs only, rather than all of these on this half after the first split. And from the hierarchical structure chart, we can see that the s equal to 2 is made on this half, and the splitting boundary is whether an RSOE has inc old score smaller than minus 0.41 or bigger than 0.41. And then for the third split, now the algorithm continues to decide we should rely on the encode to make the third split, because encode is a very important predictive variable. But now the s equal to 3, the third split is made on the another half of the RSOs following the first split, and so which is another hierarchical structure created here, and with the splitting boundary being whether an RSOA has encode score smaller than 0.05 or bigger than 1.05. Sorry, and now all of the RSOs, they are classified into 4 different nodes, which means they can have one of the 4 estimates, which is the sum, which is the average over all of the R0 within the 4 different nodes respectively. And okay, after the first 3 splits, now the algorithm decide, okay, now we have made enough split along the encode, and then it's time to make a split following the employment deprivation score, which is another dimension. So that's why the s equal to 4, the fourth split is made by the employment score, and then this fourth split is made to this node after the third split, and then these RSOs within this node, they are further split into 2 separate groups, which is the upper half and the lower half. And the splitting boundary is whether the imp score in one RSOA is smaller than 0.7 or larger than 0.7. And for the final split, the algorithm still decides to make the last split along the imp score as well, and which is made onto this node of RSOs. And the splitting boundary is here, whether one RSOA have imp score as lower than 1.44 or larger than 1.44. And now we have all of the split has been made, and this tree function has been established, and we can see that all of the RSOs fails in the same node. They have exactly the same estimate of relative risk, which is 0.7, 0.9, and 1.5, and 1.8, etc. And from this 2D plot, we can see a general pattern that those RSOs having larger income owed deprivation score and larger employment deprivation score, they tend to have larger relative mortality risk, and which is consistent to the common sense of most of people. And okay, and now after we having a readily available tree function, and we can use this f hat b, the tree model, to make predictions for any so-called new RSOs. So which are the RSOs with unknown mortality risk. So for example, if we consider these 2 green dots, they are the RSOs. We know their socioeconomic characteristics, we know their encode, and we know their employment score, but we don't know their relative mortality risk. And then we can make a prediction on their mortality risk by looking at which node do they fail into. And then for this one, we can make a prediction of 0.712. And for this one, we can make a prediction of 1.447 as the estimator of the relative mortality risk. And yeah, which is quite straightforward to make any new prediction for any new observations that we don't have enough information on. And another important thing to mention is that this stylized example is a very simple example, which has only 6 nodes within this tree. But actually in the real world or in the random forest model, we get eventually for our purpose. And so for every single tree, there are always around 30 to 50 nodes in total. So which is much more accurate and granular than this stylized example. But of course, if we're having such a complex tree, it's not that easy compared to this one to visualize in front of you. So that's why we have picked up a much simpler stylized example here instead of the real function we use in the real world. And on this particular example, f hat b, and we can instead of drawing that on a 2D plan, we can also write it down as a piecewise constant function, which takes one of the 6 values of the estimate of relative mortality risk. We can see depending on, for a particular RSOA having X as the socioeconomic characteristics, depending on what X1 and X2 are, we can pick up one of the 6 estimate to for this particular RSOA, so which is quite straightforward to show here. Here are a bit more technical details to follow up about the regression trees. In terms of when to stop making split within one tree, but of course we can't go through different layers of splits indefinitely. So we have to stop somewhere to optimize the computation burden and also the the out of sample performance. And there are different stopping criteria that we can apply. I won't introduce any details about these technical things, but I can see one of the criterion we apply is a constraint that every single node should have at least 200 RSOs. Otherwise, there's no further split is allowed onto this group of RSOs anymore. And after we stop making further split, all of the existing nodes within one tree, they are called the terminal node. So these are the node of RSOs that define the estimate of relative risk produced by any single regression tree function. And also, so we have mentioned earlier that for every single regression tree within a random forest model, they are only trained using a randomly selected subset of RSOs rather than all of the RSOs in the training set. So that is called a sample randomness we introduce into the random forest algorithm. And here we also have variable randomness as well. So which means in every single tree within random forest model, and for every single split, only a randomly selected 4 out of 12 predictive variables are considered when making this split. Yeah, it might be better to show the randomness of the sample randomness and the variable randomness within this matrix here. So, for example, this is the matrix containing all of the RSOs in the different rows of the training set and all of the predictive variables in the different columns of the training set. And we have, like for example, we have p equal to 12 predictive variables in our case. So there are 12 different columns here. And for any particular regression tree within the random forest, and if we look over the different rows, and we see that we only highlight some of the rows. So these are the RSOs randomly selected to train this particular tree. And if we look over the different columns, and we can see that only 4 columns are highlighted. So these 4 columns, they are the 4 predictive variables that one particular split can consider within this tree. And so after we, for example, after we making this particular split and we want to go to next split, then a different 4 columns will be highlighted for that tree, for that split. So which means in one same tree, in the same regression tree, the rows highlighted, they are consistent, they are constant, but for every split, they will have a different highlighted 4 columns as predictive variables to consider. And so assuming we have finished this tree and we want to move to the next tree of the random forest model, and then of course we will select a different set of rows, which means the RSO is here. So this is example of how do we introduce sample randomness as over the rows and the variable randomness over the columns into a random forest algorithm. Yeah, so after discussing all of the technical stuff in the previous slides, the relationship between regression trees and random forest is very straightforward. So as I discussed earlier, so one random forest model can be denoted as f hat RF here. So it is an ensemble of B regression trees in total. And the estimate provided by the random forest model is just the average over all individual trees estimates within this random forest. So the formula just shows that clearly. And because we have introduced both sample and variable randomness into the random forest by manipulating the different trees in slightly different ways, and compared to any single regression tree, the random forest, they can mitigate overfitting risk. And then, so which means the random forest model is much more robust to data we use to train the algorithm compared to any single regression trees. Okay, so after all of the discussions about how does the random forest work and what is it like, and now it's time to show you some of the results we produce using the random forest model. And so the results, as we discussed earlier, they are the estimate of the relative mortality risk within single RSOs by gender and by age as well. So first of all, I will show you what is the final proposed random forest model look like to estimate the relative mortality risk for RSOs. So within this random forest model, we have 2,500 number of trees in total. And as we said before, we have 12 predictive variables in total, but we only pick up 4 out of 12 for every single split within every single tree. And we also have additional constraint on the minimum size of terminal nodes within one tree can have, and otherwise we cannot make any further split to that particular single node. And so all of these hyperparameters or parameters embedded in the random forest model, so they are selected to ensure the random forest model achieves the maximum accuracy and while keeping the computational burden low. So it has to be accurate, but it has also to be efficient. The 12 predictive variables, they are selected before we train the model, and so we have a paper discuss the method we use to select these variables, and I can share with you if any of you is interested in. And the number of variables to consider per split, these 4 is selected using a technique called cross-validation, so that the out-of-sample MSE of the validation set is minimized. And the cross-validation is also a quite commonly applied technique in training the non-parametric models. And I'm sure there will be a lot of textbooks or relevant materials available online for you to have a look at if you are interested in. And the minimum size of terminal node in all trees, it is selected so that we achieve a balance between the variance over the individual trees and accuracy in the estimation. So again, it's about bias and variance trade-off, which is quite important definition for all of the non-parametric models. And again, there are a lot of textbooks and materials online, but feel free to email me anytime if you want to have a discussion with me regarding to all of these technical details. And the result we generate from the random forest model is that we apply that model to construct a longevity index for England. So in short, life index, it is called life index. So this life index measures the mortality level in one RSOA relative to the national level of England. And this index is created for single RSOAs by gender, age, and year. And those RSOAs having this index close to 1, so that means they have mortality risk close to the national average. And so this index can be used as an indicator to how high mortality risk within one RSOA, or it can also be used as a predictive variable itself alongside other factors to estimate mortality for any individuals living in one RSOA. So for example, we can use this index alongside smoking status and long-term health condition, etc., to predict longevity expectation for one particular policyholder in a pension scheme or in a life insurance annuity portfolio, etc. And by the way, it's quite important. information here is that there's another actuarial research center webinar which is presented by both my PhD supervisors, Andrew Cairns and Thorsten Kleino. So that webinar has a more complete discussion over the life index, which has more information about the index itself, rather than the technical details of the random forest model. And if any of you is interested in this, I'm sure there will be a recording available on the ARC website, or you can contact me directly and I can share that link with you. Okay, now let's look at some examples about what does the life index look like. So these two plots, they are the life index on the y-axis. So they are plotted against the INC-OAT, which is the income deprivation score for old population for single RSOAs. And every single dot represents one RSOA, and the color means the urban rural classes from 1 to 5. So just a short reminder here, 1 and 5, these are the most urbanized areas, and 2, 3, 4, so they have a decreasing level of urbanization from 2 to 4. And so the left-hand side plot is the index of age 65 of England males population, and the right-hand side is the index of age 75 of the England males population. And we can see that there's a clear trend, increasing trend in both of the plots. So that means, for those RSOs having higher income deprivation for old people, and the mortality risk is definitely much higher than those having lower lower income deprivation. And but we can also see that comparing these two ages, the higher age is significantly has a much smoother or much less steeper trend of increase. So which is consistent to most of the findings that the socioeconomic variation in the mortality is less obvious in older age population compared to the younger age population. And also we can see some separation by the colors. So which means the urban rural classes as the X12 has a non-negligible impact onto the distribution or shape of the index over the England. Okay, now let's look at the index in a slightly different way. And so now we focus on the age 75 of England males population. So first, on the right-hand side, this plot is a heat map. So x-axis is the INC-OAT and y-axis is employment score. And the colors on the left-hand side, they measures the observed relative risk, which is R0 over all of the RSOs in England. And it's equivalent plot on the right-hand side, but the only difference is the color measures the value of the life index created by the random forest model we have here. And so we can see that the most obvious difference is the index is much smoother, and because the random forest model helps us to filter out a lot of sampling variations from the observed mortalities, which is quite helpful. But both of the plots, they follow a pretty similar pattern, that those RSOAs having higher income deprivation score or employment deprivation score, and they tend to have higher mortality risk as well. And we can see a clear colored pattern from the left bottom to the top right. Like here is an increasing trend of mortality risk for population of age 75 in England. And this is another example that we kind of project the level of the life index of age 75 of England males population onto the England map. And we can see that every single dot represents one single RSOA, and we can see a clear cluster of higher mortality risk distributed around big city areas like London and Manchester and Newcastle, etc. And in comparison, those more rural RSOs, they in general have relatively lower relative risk, and which is also consistent to the common sense and also to the findings from many other researches as well. And now on this slide, it shows some of the cumulative distribution function plot, which are the CDF plots that shows the distribution shape of the index, that is looked at by different groups of RSOs. And for example, the first one here is the CDF of index value by ages, and they are distribution of index at 3 different ages. We look at here, age 65, 75, and 85, and we can see that as age growing, you know, the distribution of the life index just get narrowed significantly. So which is consistent to the finding that, you know, the socioeconomic differences in mortality is much less obvious in the higher age population compared to younger age populations. And for the second plot, it is the index, it's the index value at age 75 again, but it's plotted by different regions of England, and there are 9 regions in total, and we can see a clear separation over different regions. And so according to this plot, we can see that southeast and southwest, they are the 2 distributed on the top, and northwest and northeast, these are the 2 regions in the bottom. And we can see that on the side of having a high index value, there are much more RSOs distributed here in the northwest and northeast compared to the southeast and southwest. So that means by looking at value of this life index, northwest and northeast, these are the 2 regions that having highest mortality, relative mortality risk at age 75, and southeast and southwest, these are the 2 kind of lowest mortality regions of the pensionable age or retirement age. And lastly, we can see the distribution plot that is separated by the urban-rural classes, which are the 1 to 5 from major conurbation to the rural village, and also we have class 5 means major conurbations in London. We can see there's again a clearly separation between them, and we can see that for the class 4, class 3, and 4, which are the rural RSOs, their distribution is much more left shifted compared to those other regions, which means the index value in these 2 urban-rural classes, they are much lower than those more urbanized areas. And this table here shows quite similar information and to the CDF plots on the previous slide, but it just shows the summary statistics by numbers here. And we can see that compared to all of the England, we can see that class 3 and 4, which means the rural town, fringe, or village, these RSOs, they have significantly lower index value, so which is the distribution is much more left skewed compared to most of the other regions. And meanwhile, the class 1, class 2, and class 5 of London, they have the distribution much more closer to the overall national distribution. And so so in summary, according to the distribution of the life index value, we can know that, you know, the mortality difference relevant to socioeconomics is not that significant in population of high ages compared to those of younger ages. And north of England, in general, have higher mortality risk than the south of the pensionable age. And RSOs as conurbations and large cities have widest distribution of the relative risk compared to the other classes. And those rural RSOs in class 3 and 4, they in general have lower relative risk compared to the more urbanized ones. And London, those RSOs in London as class 5, they in general have lowest relative mortality risk in all of the major conurbation and large cities. Okay, reaching to the end of the webinar today, let's look at the summary of what we have discussed in today's webinar. Yeah, so for the random forest algorithm, there are several advantages that if we use that to make some predictions or estimations. So first of all, it is a non-parametric model. So the structure means it doesn't require too much prior assumption or knowledge about the functional relationship between the response and the predictor variables. For example, in comparison, the GLM, we have to assume what distribution does the variable follow, and we have to assume that what particular relationship between the y and x we have to know in advance before running the model. But for the random forest, we don't need any of these. And also the random forest model is invariant to transformation of the predictor variables, which means it is more flexible on handling different types of data. And also, for example, in this particular model we discussed today, we have both categorical and numerical variables at the same time with no problem. And also it captures any potential interactions over the predictive variables instead of needing us to set them up by judgment or experience. Or for example, if two of the predictive variables, their production can be a very useful additional variable. And in the random forest model, we don't need to set this up particularly, but in many of the commonly used parametric models, for example, GLM, we have to add an additional predictor variable as x1 times x2 alongside all of the other variables, so which requires quite a lot of judgment or experience applied. And also in terms of efficiency, the random forest model in general runs faster than some other non-parametric models. For example, local linear regression and kernel estimator. These two non-parametric models, they are also quite flexible and shares some of the same advantage with the random forest model, but the difference is they are not that fast compared to the random forest model. And although random forest model has a lot of advantages and good benefits we can have, but we have to always keep in mind that the random forest model sometimes can be less interpretable than most parametric models because it doesn't have a closed form formula. And also compared to single regression trees, which we can draw that regression tree in a hierarchical chart, as I did in this webinar. For the random forest model, it's not that easy to show what does it look like. So we have to keep in mind of this one, and we have to make sure that we understand how does it work exactly to avoid any misuse or avoid any overfitting, etc. Okay, that's all about the webinar today, and that's all of the discussions we have today in this webinar. And thanks very much for joining me, and I hope you like it, and I hope you found out at least something is useful within this pack. And apologize because this is a recorded webinar rather than a live stream, so I can't take any questions here. But if you have any questions, or if you have any feedbacks on the improvement I can make, or if you don't agree, or if you want to challenge some of the discussions I have today, please do feel free to email me at any of these two email addresses. I will look at all of the emails, and I will be more than happy to have some further discussion with any of you if you have any questions or feedbacks on my works or on the much wider research subject. And yeah, thanks again. Thank you very much, and have a nice day then. Bye.